Hi everyone, my name is Ansh. I lead education here at the Fremont Debate Academy, and today I'm excited to talk to you about refuting, or the art of responding to arguments. Let's get started. So in this comic, you see John from Garfield trying to defend one of his viewpoints by saying he's correct because he said so, and that's why. As you can see, this probably isn't enough to defend your claims, and this is an example of a bad counter-refute. In this video, we're going to be showing you how to make good counter-refutes, how to be compelling in the way that you refute and respond to refutes in debate rounds. So we're going to get started with the basics. So first things first, what are refutes and what are counter-refutes? Simply put, refutes are when you disagree with an argument raised by your opponents. And the purpose of refutations or refutes is to disprove an opponent's argument. You do this primarily by showing that it is either problematic, weak, incomplete, poorly proven, or false to some degree. Remember that a refute to an opponent's refute is called a counter-refute. This might be complicated. You can remember it by just looking at counter and refute. You're countering the refute to defend yourself. And these are used to defend your own side and help support it. So because we're going to be talking about refutes quite a bit in this video, it's important to first discuss why they're important. Let's do this through an analogy. Throughout the debate round, you and your opponent are competing to build skyscrapers. At the end of the round, you want to have the tallest skyscraper. And your skyscraper in this analogy represents your case. Your case is constructed based off of all the contentions and arguments that you run within a debate round. So your contentions help to make your skyscraper taller, and your refutations help to break down your opponent's skyscraper. So as you can see, if the goal of this debate game is to have your skyscraper be taller than your opponent's skyscraper, the way to do that is to either add more contentions onto your case or refute more contentions to break down the opponent's case. So as you can see, refutes are almost just as important as contentions are, so that's why we should take them seriously. So here's an illustration of this concept. As you can see in this example, proposition is the winner of the debate because their skyscraper is taller. They either brought up more contentions than the opposition, or they had better refutations to the opposition case. And likely it was a combination of the two. So you want to make sure to prioritize your refutations just as much as you prioritize bringing up your contentions. Now let's get into the different types of refutes that there are. So the two types of refutes are blocks and turns. Let's start by discussing block refutes. Block refutes are defensive and they show how your opponent's argument is wrong. So using the skyscraper analogy, let's say that the opposition is trying to put a block on top of their skyscraper. The proposition can remove this block from being added, and that would be a block refute. It blocks that piece of evidence or that contention from benefiting the opponent's case. And it does not allow that skyscraper or the case to be constructed further or the skyscraper to get taller. A turn is more offensive because it shows how your opponent's argument actually supports your side. So in the skyscraper analogy, this would be not only blocking that block from adding on the opposition's case, but also adding that onto the proposition's case. Remember, a turn is better than block in this way because it takes material from the opponent's skyscraper from their case and adds it towards yours. Here's another visualization to really hit this point home. You can think of blocks and turns in a game of basketball. A block is like blocking an opponent's shot in basketball. You prevent them from scoring. But a turn is like a turnover or a steal, where you not only block their shot because they're not allowed to score if you have possession of the ball, you also run down the other side of the floor and score the basket on their hoop. And this kind of demonstrates how turns are more effective and can be stronger than blocks. Here's an example to communicate this point one more time. Let's say that you have the argument that homework causes stress. A block refute to this might be, homework does not cause stress because many schools operate on guidelines preventing them from giving too much homework on any single day. You can tell this is a block refute because this basically says that, you know what, homework does not cause stress because, schools have these guidelines that make it such that you can't give so much homework that it's going to cause stress. A turn refute to this might be, homework causes less stress in the long run because it gives students a better understanding of the content. This helps them on assessments and more challenging courses that they can take later on in life. So this turn refute not only explains why homework does not cause stress, it goes one step further and says that homework actually reduces stress because of the fact that homework reinforces concepts and makes students more familiar with the content that they need to learn, which helps them do better on things like tests in the future. So hopefully now you know the difference between blocks and turns and understand why turns are more effective than blocks. Now let's do a quick drill on practicing how to get multiple refutes out. So try to think of multiple refutes to the following argument. And it's important to have multiple refutes because if you have multiple responses or multiple refutes to an opponent's contention, it's more likely that the judge believes one of them, and it's a lot harder for your opponents to respond to 3 or 4 different refutes as compared to just one. So the argument that we're going to be practicing with is starting school earlier is good because it gives more time for students to pursue other activities. Now let's pause the video here really quickly, and we're going to show you the sample refutes that we came up with to this topic. Okay, hopefully you had a second to do that. Let's get into it. So some sample answers to this argument, some sample refutes. The first sample refute is when school starts earlier, students get less sleep, which research has shown can lead to depression and obesity. So this refute clearly shows why school starting earlier is not a good thing because if students don't get enough sleep, they're going to have health problems. The second refute is that attendance rates are higher when schools start later. And this implies that starting school earlier will lower these attendance rates, which is a bad thing because students need to go to school in order to get the education. And refute number 3 is that when students are tired and sleep deprived, the probability of them pursuing after-school activities is lower. And what you can see here, this is clearly a turn refute because it responds to the argument, responds to refute, and actually shows why students are not going to be able to do as well with their after-school activities if school starts earlier because of the sleep deprivation aspect of it. So that's clearly a turn refute. That would probably be the strongest refute amongst the 3 refutes. Now let's get into the specific types of refutes. So in addition to blocks and turns, you can also refute each aspect of the ARESI components, except the assertion though. It's no point in refuting the assertion, it's just a 3 to 7 word title. Let's get into how to do this. So you can refute the reasoning by saying something along the lines of, the reasoning behind this point is invalid because, and then you can explain an alternative cause for a problem, for the problem that the opponents talk about. Maybe this shows why what the opponents are saying is contradictory, or why it's just not logical, and why this refutes the foundation of their contention. You can refute the evidence by saying something along the lines of, the evidence that they used to support their point is incorrect because, and then continue to explain why they misinterpreted their evidence. Another thing you can do is show how the opponent's evidence is outdated, or how it's not relevant anymore, and why your evidence should be preferred instead. You can refute the source by saying something like, their point is not valid because the source they used is not reliable. Maybe the opponents use Wikipedia or procon.org. They're sources where anybody can edit the information, and so we're not sure whether or not the information that came from that source is actually credible. You can refute the impact by saying that the opponent's impacts won't happen because, maybe explain why they have a low likelihood of occurring, which means that the underlying contention might not be as important if the impacts or what that contention is trying to achieve aren't actually important either. So let's get into the importance of these specific refutes. When you target specific aspects of these points, you weaken the opponent's entire case. For example, when you refute impacts, as I just mentioned, the point loses its power. If the contention is building up, the A, R, E, and S are building up towards making the impact matter, but you explain how the impact does not matter, then it doesn't matter whatever came before that, right? That's not as important. And so this kind of overrules the contention. It's also really important to always refute the reasoning because reasoning is the logic behind the contention. And if you refute that chunk of it, then the rest of the aspects sometimes don't really matter. For example, the impacts cannot be accessed if the point isn't logical in the first place. Also, certain aspects of a point may be more important to your opponent's case. For example, a single contention or argument might be the crux of the opponent's entire case. And so you want to focus on refuting that point to kind of collapse their entire case. This would be like in the skyscraper analogy, you get rid of the foundation on which the skyscraper is built. And that's an easy way to topple their entire case. Also remember that successfully refuting a point allows you to break down part of your opponent's skyscraper. So it's always very important to refute. It's also important to think about where this point is on the opponent's skyscraper, whether it's at the foundation, whether it's at the top, to see where you want to spend your time. Now let's go into some tips on refuting and counter-refuting. So before we get into this, we want to mention that we've already mentioned some tips in our how to give the second speech video that we mentioned. And those tips include speaking logically, staying relaxed, and refuting in chronological order. With that being said, let's get into some things to avoid. So you want to avoid dropping arguments. Dropping an argument is when you forget to respond to an argument. Maybe the opponents are in a contention and you forget to refute it. You don't want to do this because when you drop an argument, you give the opponent space to, in their speech, go on and say that, hey, look, the opponents dropped our argument. That means that they don't have a refute to it. They agree with it. And thus, it's very important that this argument is valued higher in the round because it clearly must be very important that the opponents can't refute it. And they can kind of use this one contention to overrule the rest of your contentions and really emphasize that. You don't want them to do that. And similarly, if your opponents drop one of your arguments, you want to make a big deal out of it. It's a good way to come ahead in the round, and you want to definitely point that out to the judge. Next, don't admit that you don't have a refute to a contention. Remember that you always want to do your best to refute the contention in any way that you can. And if you can't refute, the least you can do is compare your contentions with the opponent's contentions to show the judge how you're still doing some weighing, where you're still comparing the two sides and you don't have nothing to say. Thirdly, you don't want to only refute either the evidence or the source of a contention. You want to have detailed refutes that address the crux of the contention, because oftentimes the evidence and the source is an afterthought to the underlying logic of the contention. And if you don't respond to the logic, well, it doesn't really matter if you refute the evidence because that logic might still stand. And thus the judge might still vote for the other team based off of that logic on that contention. So now we're going to do a little bit of a drill here. We've got 4 different refutes. We want you to pause the video and pick out which are refutes that are good, that you should say in a debate round, and which are ones that you shouldn't. So take a moment and then we'll show you our responses. Okay, hopefully you had a moment. Let's get into it. So the first thing, we do not have a refute for XYZ arguments. So let's move on. You do not want to do this. Remember, you want to do your best to always refute the opponent's contentions as best as you can. You never want to admit to the judge that you don't have a refute. You want to always do your best. And even if you can't, fake it till you make it. Second of all, maybe a refute is they did not give a source, so their entire contention means nothing. This is a bad refute because, again, this does not address the underlying logic behind the opponent's contention, which still might be intact. So just refuting their source is definitely not enough here. Third of all, they do not have any evidence for this argument, so they should automatically lose. This is not a good refute because, again, evidence is not everything. The logic still matters. And also, you want to avoid using absolutes like this or extreme statements where the opponents should automatically lose because of having no evidence. You kind of want to stray away from those types of arguments. They tend to go against you. Fourth of all, we have, Judge, I want you to notice that my opponents dropped XYZ arguments, which is significant because, and this is something that you want to do. Again, you want to point out when your opponents drop your arguments and you want to make a big deal out of them. You want to explain why they're significant and why you're winning because of that. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments of this video. We'll get to them as soon as we can. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. And yeah, that's it. Thank you everyone for watching. Have a great day and happy debating.